Chapter 10. The New Vow. The equinox arrived the way important things always did, quietly, without announcement, as though it had simply always been coming and did not require fanfare to prove it. Saoirse woke before dawn and lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling of her room in the eastern tower. She had slept deeply, dreamlessly, the way she had every night for the past 2 weeks, the thornwood settling around her like something that had decided she was not a visitor anymore. Outside the window the sky was the particular dark blue of the hour before first light, the color she had come to love most in this place, the color that was neither night nor day but the breath between them. She rose, dressed, the clothes Thessaly had brought her 3 days ago, not her ember-thrown wool, not a hostage's practical traveling gear, but something woven from sylvane cloth, deep green, simple and precise. She had looked at it for a long moment when Thessaly set it down, and Thessaly had said, perfectly casually, the archivist suggested it. For the ritual, the third bloodline's color is green, and then left before Saoirse could process her expression. She pressed her mother's pendant against her sternum, put the letter inside her coat, folded to the page she had read most, the one that ended "Be angry, and be careful, and know that you were loved." She took the leather cord from her wrist, where she had worn it since Erevan had, without ceremony or explanation, placed it there 4 days ago, sliding it from his own wrist to hers with the quiet finality of someone passing something to where it belonged, and held it in her palm for a moment. Her father's bracelet, his grief, her inheritance. She put it back on. Went to meet the equinox. The Thornwood's ritual site was not the citadel. She had known this from the translation, had known the original sealing had taken place at the border, at the root source of the Covenant's power, but knowing and standing there were different things. They walked out before dawn, the full council and Erevan and Thessaly and the archivist and Vython, who moved through the pre-dawn forest with the careful dignity of a man who understood he was permitted to be here only because the people he had wronged were generous enough to allow it, and Marin, who had flatly declined to remain at the citadel and whom no one had seriously attempted to stop. The site was a clearing, not like the citadel's courtyard, not maintained or cultivated, but genuinely wild, a natural break in the canopy where the roots of the surrounding trees all pointed inward, converging toward a central point in the ground where the soil was darker than the rest, and the moss grew in an exact circle, and the air had a quality she had no word for except oldest. In the center of the circle, where the dead tree had stood, where its roots still ran, she understood now, deep and persistent under the ground even in death, there was a single new growth. A sapling, pale bark, copper leaves no larger than her thumbnail, 3 inches tall. She stopped when she saw it. The archivist appeared at her shoulder. "It began growing 10 days ago," they said, quietly. "The night you first held the general's hand in the archive." She looked at the archivist. Their pale eyes were warm with something ancient and amused. "The Covenant knows what it knows," they said, and moved away to take their place at the circle's edge. Saoirse stood at the edge of the root circle and looked at the sapling and felt the resonance in her chest rise to meet it, that recognition, the matching frequency, the language her blood had always spoken and she was only now fully fluent in. The sapling's copper leaves trembled in air that was not moving. Erevan came to stand beside her. He was in his formal military dress, the dark gray, the silver hardware, but without the general's careful distance. He stood close, her shoulder to his arm, and looked at the sapling with an expression that was open and tired and very, very relieved. "Are you ready?" he said. "I've been ready since I was born," she said. "I just didn't know for what." He looked at her then, sidelong, close, and the almost smile arrived, warmer than it had ever been, and she thought, that's it. That's the whole of him, right there in that expression. All 190 years and every scar and every careful rebuilt piece of him, just entirely here. "Then let's begin," he said. The ritual was not what she had imagined. She had read the translation so many times she could have recited it, and still the doing of it was nothing like the reading. The archivist spoke the old words at the circle's edge, the formal invocation, the calling of the Covenant's 3 parties, and the council responded in kind, and then it was quiet, and the sight waited. First the Sylvain blood. Erevan drew a small cut across his palm with a ceremonial blade, unhesitating, the motion of someone who has done hard things and does not make theatre of them, and pressed it to the sapling's bark. The pale wood darkened where his blood met it. A pulse moved through the roots, visible in the soil, spreading outward through the clearing like a ripple in still water. The council elder did the same, the Ember bloodline proxy, a gesture of the human throne's consent transmitted through her father's written authority, and the pulse came again, deeper. Then the archivist looked at Saoirse. She stepped into the circle. The moss was soft under her feet. The clearing was very still, the whole thornwood seeming to hold itself, that vast, patient breath suspended. She was aware of the council watching, of Marin's steady eyes at the edge of the circle, of Thessaly, arms folded, expression brilliant with suppressed emotion, of Vython, standing apart, the face of a man who has seen a long work finally completed and is not certain whether he has the right to feel relief about it. Of Erevan, a step behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back, present without intruding, which was so entirely him that she nearly smiled. She crouched before the sapling. She pressed her uncut palm to the ground first, open, flat, deliberate. Felt the roots beneath the soil, felt the Covenant's old intelligence stir in response, felt the resonance in her chest rise fully for the first time without her pressing it down, without the lifelong reflex of concealment. She let it come. The amber light was warm and steady in her eyes. Not the sudden detonation of the council chamber. This was chosen, offered, the difference between a door blown open and a door opened by hand. She picked up the ceremonial blade. Willingly, her mother's letter had said. The word matters more than anything. She cut her palm, pressed it to the sapling. The world held its breath. Then it exhaled. The pulse that moved through the clearing was nothing like the first two. It was larger, older, the resonance of something that had been waiting not 6 weeks or 3 months but 100 years, a patient, deep-rooted thing finally receiving what it had been owed. The roots lit up under the soil, tracing lines outward through the forest, bioluminescent blue-green brightening as the Covenant's power refound its channels, running to the border and beyond it, running to the Ember Throne's foundations and to every stone that had been signed into the original piece. The sapling grew, slowly, then faster, the Sylvain healing principle, she thought, distantly. The acceleration of natural process, the pale bark thickening, the copper leaves multiplying, the trunk straightening and rising until it was knee-high, waist-high, the height of a child, the height of a person, still going, 3 years of growth in 3 minutes, 5 years, 10, the roots spreading through the dark soil in patterns she could see and feel both, the tree finding its shape. It stopped at perhaps 20 years of growth, young, she thought, by the Covenant's reckoning. Young and living and copper-leafed in the equinox light that was just beginning to break through the canopy above the clearing, the first true light of the new season falling precisely, as though it had been arranged, across the pale bark of the new tree. Silence. Then the head elder spoke, in Sylvain, and the archivist's voice came soft at the circle's edge. The covenant is renewed. The 3 bloods have been given. The vow of ash stands. Saoirse stood. Her hand was bleeding still, gently, and she pressed it closed and looked at the tree and felt the resonance in her chest settle into something new, not the urgent hum of something waking, but the steady, permanent warmth of something that had come home. Something that knew where it was and intended to stay. A hand settled against her back. Not the formal placement of a warden, not the steadying touch of someone managing a situation. His palm, flat and warm between her shoulder blades, and his voice low and close, well done. She turned. He was looking at her with the full open expression, the unmanaged, unguarded one, the man behind every other version of himself, and the equinox light was gold across his face and his eyes were the clearest green she had ever seen them, entirely still, entirely present. You're crying, she said, surprised. He was, very slightly, the kind of tears that don't fall, that just stand in the eyes of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally, carefully, set it down. "Don't note it for the record," he said. "I would never," she said, and put her arms around him and held on. He held her back, both arms, fully, the way he had in the study, but without the 6 days between them, without the equinox still to come, without anything between this moment and what it was. She felt his exhale against her hair, long and slow. 190 years setting themselves down in a forest clearing on the first morning of spring. Around them the council was moving, beginning the formal closing rites, and Thessaly was making no attempt whatsoever to look at anything other than the two of them, and Marin had her hand pressed to her mouth, and the archivist was watching the new tree with an expression of ancient, complete satisfaction. Saoirse kept her face against his shoulder and felt the new covenant thrumming in the roots below her feet and thought about everything the last 4 weeks had given her and taken from her and rebuilt her into. She thought about her mother, who had left a letter in a locked chest for the daughter she couldn't stay to raise, trusting that the world would arrange itself correctly. Who had been right? She thought about her father, imperfect and distant and choosing what he could. About Marin, who had run through a forest with broken ribs to bring her what she needed. About Thessaly, who had kept a record of smiles. About the archivist, who had waited 17 years for this morning. She thought about Erevan, who had made himself into something Los couldn't touch and then stood very still while she touched it anyway, and had not moved away. They walked back to the citadel as the sun rose fully over the thornwood. Not the formal procession of the walkout. The council moved ahead, the ceremony concluded, the morning opening into ordinary day. She and Erevan walked behind the rest, unhurried, through the silver-barked trees and the carpet of copper leaves and the brightening moss, and the forest was so full of sound, the birds, the wind, the deep creak of old wood, the water somewhere far below the roots, that talking felt less necessary than breathing. After a while he took her hand. Not the archive hold, not the forehead against hers in the corridor, not the arm around her back in the study. Just her hand in his, fingers laced, the leather cord from her father's wrist warm between their palms. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. "So," she said. "So," he agreed. "I have to go back." She watched his face. "Not forever, not completely, but there are things at the Ember Throne that need settling in person. Caden's trial, my father." A pause. The new treaty presented formally. "I know. 2 months. Perhaps 3. I know." He looked at her. The green of his eyes was steady and warm and not afraid. "I will be here when you return. You'll be here every year when I return." "Every year," he confirmed. "And any time between that you choose to come." She looked at him for a long moment in the morning light of the new spring, in a forest that had called to her blood for 100 years and finally been answered, beside a man who had been keeping himself from exactly this for far too long. "I want to show you the Ember Throne," she said. "The parts worth showing. The eastern coast. The painting my mother left me." She paused. "When things are settled, I want you to see where I came from." Something moved through his face, warm and slow and unguarded. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." She nodded. They walked on. The citadel rose ahead of them through the trees, its walls threaded with roots and its windows lit with morning, the new covenant running below their feet through the deep old network of the thornwood's roots, running all the way to the border and beyond, running to every place where peace had been agreed and blood had been given and people had chosen, in the oldest possible language, to hold. She thought, "I came here a hostage." She thought, "I am leaving an heir, a signatory, a daughter of 2 bloodlines and 2 worlds, a person who knows what she carries and has chosen how to carry it." She thought, "I am leaving, and I am coming back, and the difference between those 2 things is everything." She thought, last of all, the simplest thought, "I am glad." Glad for the dead tree and the locked chest and the letter in her mother's hand. Glad for the narrow corridors and the blue-lit archive and the pine and honey drink and the 11 years of a smile finally ended. Glad for all of it, the hard way and the long way and the only way it could have happened, which was exactly like this. The thornwood sang around her. The new tree's roots reached further every hour. And somewhere in the eastern tower a candle burned above a desk full of border records, marking the room of a woman who had come here against her will and was leaving on her own terms, and would return, every spring, for as long as springs came, which, if the covenant held, was a very long time indeed. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They walked through the citadel gate together as the morning opened fully over the thornwood, gold and copper and alive. End of chapter 10. The Vow of Ash. Epilogue. The covenant was renewed on the spring equinox, in the first year of the new treaty between the throne of embers and the Sylvane. It has held every year since. The third bloodline tends the tree. The general keeps watch at the border. And every spring, without fail, a woman with amber light in her eyes rides into the thornwood and the forest recognizes her before she clears the first mile, the roots brightening below the path, the copper leaves turning toward her the way all living things turn toward what they have been waiting for. She never minds the waiting. She was taught, by a letter and a forest and a man who wrote formidable in margins, that the things worth having are worth every mile of the road to reach them. She arrives, every year, and the tree grows taller. That is enough. That is everything.